6:31, we'll give them a couple more minutes. I see friends here from Anchorage, Sitka, the Lower Mainland, all over Vancouver Island. We'll just give people a couple more minutes.
You're watching.
All right, we're just now at 6:33 Pacific time and people are still filing in, but why don't we go ahead and get started. My name is Dave Secord and I'm on the board of the Salt Spring Island Conservancy. I would like to warmly welcome all of you to the 2020 Salt Spring Island Conservancy event, which would normally occur in the community of Ganges in a physical building called Art Spring. But thanks to COVID-19, we have the privilege of gathering online this year in front of a virtual fire, which isn't like being together with cookies, but it's not half bad. So on behalf of the board and staff, including board chair, Dr. Susan Hannon, and our executive director, Dr. Penny Barnes, I just want to say we're thrilled that you're all here. We would like to acknowledge that at least those of us here in the Salt Spring community are in the unceded territory and home of the ancestors of Coast Salish First Nations of this island and surrounding waters of the Salish Sea, people who continue to use and steward these lands and waters, including the Hulkaminam, Wasanik, and Sawasan First Nations. A bit of housekeeping about Zoom. We will be giving you the option of gallery view or speaker view. You are probably experienced Zoom users by now, so in the upper right corner of your screen, if you hit gallery view, you see the whole audience. If you hit speaker view, you will just see the individuals who are spotlit as speakers, who will be our main speakers, plus me until I step away when the main event begins. You'll be happy to know soon. For questions, feel free to use the chat function in the lower part of your screen. You can put questions in chat at any point and I will curate those at the end of the main event. We will have a good amount of time for Q&A and discussion. And you can also put questions in at that time. Just a note about the timing of this event. Officially, we will wrap up at 8 o'clock Pacific time. So we'll leave a good 20 or 30 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. However, our speakers have agreed to hang out afterwards, just like in a real event, for another half hour or so. So if you would like to stay past 8 o'clock and engage in some smaller group discussion or keep asking questions, you're very welcome to do that. Beverages will be BYO. Just a few thank yous. I'd like to thank the sponsors who have helped make this event possible, including local businesses, Country Grocer, Nature Works, and Dragland Design Build, as well as Salt Spring Books, which is easily able to acquire for you the books by our speakers tonight, including this book by Terry Chapin, fresh out, and also any of the books of our moderator, Briony Penn, and in the future, books by Skye Augustine when she decides to write books. I'd also like to thank our speakers for generously donating their time tonight. Just a quick word about the Salt Spring Island Conservancy, which is hosting this event, because we have people from all over the North Pacific joining us, not just from the island. The Conservancy is a land trust which has been working to protect land and biodiversity and culture on Salt Spring for 25 years. We've protected over 2,000 acres through acquisition and covenants, as well as stewardship agreements. And a big part of what the Conservancy does is public engagement and community partnerships with diverse community organizations. So your ticket fees help to support all of that work and events like this, as do any generous extra donations that you may have made or will make. So on behalf of the Conservancy, we're all very grateful for those. So now let's move on to the main event tonight. Our conversation this evening is meant to expand our minds and help us build bridges and span boundaries, boundaries between generations, boundaries across cultures, boundaries across big geographies from here in the Salish Sea all the way to the high Arctic, and to stretch our minds a bit on what words like science and conservation and stewardship and community mean. This is the 25th anniversary year for the Conservancy, and we might have some discussions about what conservation approaches might look like in the next 25 years that have been different from the last 25 years. So our speakers tonight are Terry Chapin and Skye Augustine. Their bios circulated earlier, so I won't do lengthy ones, and you'll get to know them as people shortly. But Terry, in brief, is an ecologist who has done field work in Arctic and subarctic Alaska for decades, and is a professor emeritus at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, where it is something like -20 Celsius right now. And Terry has worked not only in the biological side of ecology, but has done a great deal of work over many years in partnership with communities, including Indigenous communities, and around ideas of stewardship. And that's the subject of his new book. Skye Augustine, our other primary speaker, is a doctoral student at Simon Fraser University, worked for years as the Clam Garden Coordinator for Parks Canada, and has both Indigenous and settler ancestry, which she will describe. I've gotten to know both Terry and Skye through various projects, and I just think you're in for a huge treat tonight. Moderating this evening will be Briony Penn, who needs no introduction here on Salt Spring. Briony's a fifth-generation settler around here, an artist, a writer, a geographer, a scholar, a biographer, a storyteller, and a friend to many. So with all of that by way of introduction, I will pass the baton over to you, Briony, to take us away.
I brought one with me. Can everybody hear me? We've got some thumbs up from the, great. So welcome everybody. It's such an honor to be here and being moderate for a change. And I think that we've only just had a little tip of the iceberg in terms of who our speakers are tonight. And I want to jump in right at the beginning with a question about where their love of the natural world comes from, just so that we've got an opportunity to have a fuller and deeper sort of introduction to these two people. So I'm going to start with Skye, the elder in training. So Skye, maybe you can tell us, where does your love of the natural world come from?
It's so good to be sharing this space with all of you this evening. My Ho'okameam name is Hwasinyan. My English name is Skye Augustine. And both of my parents, I grew up in the Cowichan Valley, in the 5 square kilometer area that is the city of Duncan. But both of my parents are from the Cowichan Valley. And on my mother's side, I'm from the Marston and the Silvey families. And we're from the Stitminas Nation with relations in Cowichan, Penelakut, Squamish, and Sechelt territories. And on my father's side, I am of settler ancestry of Swedish and Scottish and Irish ancestry. And I think that when I'm answering that question, I feel like there's kind of 3 main places that my natural love came from. My first is my family. I think second is observation. And the third, I think, is probably from the land itself, because I think once you start paying attention, or for me anyway, once I started paying attention to the lands and waters around me, I just continue feeling more compelled to pay attention, to learn, and to protect the ecosystems that are around. But when I'm thinking about where my love of the natural world comes from, as a kid, I grew up spending a lot of time outside and paying a lot of attention. So a lot of our lives were kind of organized around the seasons. I spent time at the river and growing tadpoles and watching, and every day drawing diagrams of how they were developing and how they were growing. And as soon as my dad grew up on Cowichan Lake, because his family worked at the mill, and every year, as soon as the snow melted on the mountains around Cowichan Lake, we were allowed to go swimming. And I would be in the water from then until we had to go back to school. Mm-hmm. It was actually my dad's mom, my grandmother, my Nan, who first instilled in me kind of the strongest sense of place. And my Nan loved cedar trees. She taught me to pay attention to when flowers were blooming. And it was my Nan who my favorite way to fall asleep was listening to Nan stories. And so going for drives, I can go for drives through the Cowichan Valley and recount all of the places that my family is connected to. And I can talk about the hill that my grandma lost her shoe when she was a kid. I can describe, when we drive past, I can point out the place that my great-grandmother was born. And I know the place that the blackberries were best last year. And so I think that this kind of connection to not only the seasons that I've experienced myself, but the seasons that my family has experienced and those places that those stories are anchored to has always allowed me to feel like I really have a place that I belong to and a place that I can call home. It wasn't until I was an adult that I really started connecting with my mom's mom in a much deeper way. And when I was 19, I got to go and visit Clam Beach with her. And it was with her and with her sister, my Auntie Cheryl. And on this day, we were digging clams, and we were watching people harvest crabs, and we were talking about all of our kind of ancestral connections to these places, as well as all the different ways that we love to eat these foods. And at the end of the day, my grandmother, she reached over to me and she put her hand on my arm, and she looked at me for a second, and then she said, "Granddaughter, this is the same beach that I dug clams with my grandmother. And this is the same beach that she dug clams with her grandmother. This is the way things are supposed to be." And so I think that it's these moments and it's these connections to not only the places that hold significance to me, but also kind of the ancestral responsibilities we have to revisit the same places our ancestors have looked after for generations and since time immemorial. That has really given me a love for the natural world, but also a strong sense of responsibility to make sure that this home can continue to be a nurturing place for my grandchildren and my grandchildren's grandchildren.
Great.
That's wonderful, Skye. I really appreciate all those things you said. They really resonate with me. As you said, it was really my family that first got me introduced me to nature, and they took me hiking. They took me camping. We went fishing. We picked huckleberries. We did all sorts of things outside. And when they weren't paying any attention to me, I went walking in the woods or went up to the neighbors and picked strawberries. And so I've always felt more comfortable being outside than inside. So I can totally resonate with what you're saying. One of the things that happened to me a couple of years ago that was really interesting is that I was looking through photograph albums that my great-grandparents had put together. And my great-grandfather was a third generation New York City boy. He grew up in New York City, and that was where he was from. But every summer he took his family someplace else. Sometimes they went to Maine or to upstate New York, and they just spent a month doing things outside. He took his son fishing and canoeing and hunting and all of the kinds of things that connected them to the land. And then my grandfather took my father to places along the Connecticut River, and they went camping and fishing and did all of the same kinds of things. And my parents did the same thing for me. And I've done the same thing for our kids. We live in Alaska, so our kids had plenty of time and plenty of places to be outside, just the way you were describing. And that's probably the places that I feel most closely connected to now. And now my son has moved to Cardiff, Wales. He lives in a city, but he takes his kids out hiking and walking in the park or going into the hills around the city. And they feel a very strong connection to the land. And my granddaughter loves to climb trees and play hide and seek when nobody else can see her up in the top of a tree. And so over 6 generations and over a century, this connection to nature has kept itself alive, not because people lived all of the time in nature, but in this case, because they really valued the time spent in nature. Most of the photographs that my great-grandfather put into his photo album were pictures of things they did in nature, not the times they spent in New York City. And I think that's interesting because probably the strongest determinant of whether somebody has strong environmental concerns is whether they spent time as a kid in nature. And golly, that's something that each of us can do with our families, and our grandchildren, they can do with their grandchildren. So I totally understand and what you were saying about the importance of these places being handed down from generation to generation. Now, the first place I really felt strongly attached to was the area on the Columbia River as it goes through the Cascade Mountains. And I grew up in North Carolina, but we'd travel out there to visit my grandmother in the summertime. And we always stopped at Celilo Falls, which is a big falls in the Columbia River. And we would stop and watch the Yakima Indians fishing for salmon, netting salmon from these rickety platforms above the falls. And then in 1957, we stopped there again, and the falls was gone. A few months earlier, they closed the floodgates on the newly built Dalles Dam, and that erased thousands of years of fishing in that place, all in the name of progress. So that gave me, that's the first time I felt that I really lost something from nature, because other times I'd sort of gone to different places in nature and never had felt a strong connection to one place. And I suppose the other place I feel a really strong connection to nature is here in Alaska, where I've lived for the last 40 or 50 years. It's a great spot. We can spend time doing things outside. Our kids did the same, and I feel really strongly attached to it. So that, all of those things have built a really strong personal relationship with nature for me. And then I felt like a kid in a candy store when I got a job as an ecologist at the University of Alaska, because that gave me an excuse to go out and play around in nature for the rest of my life, and I've been doing it ever since.
Thanks, Terry. I have to say that the photograph in your book, the Grassroots Stewardship of the falls before and after, is really quite a, it's quite a profound photograph, and it reminds me too of people fishing on the Fraser, you know, before changes, and that kind of sense of loss. And I think one of the things that was, you know, people are really, I think, probably curious in the audience about is how we are starting to bring together, say, the settler, the Western scientific views of nature, and then an indigenous worldview. And I'm interested from both of your perspectives in how those worldviews have kind of come together personally. And Skye, you started sort of down the road with those first kind of inklings of love that were raised by both your settler side of your family and the indigenous side of your family. And so I'm just wondering if you can sort of pick up from there and talk about your experiences where these worldviews come together, and we'll go back to Skye.
Sure. Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting topic. This is, for me anyway, as an academic and as an Indigenous scholar, this is an area that I think you could spend, well, my entire dissertation thinking about. But one of the places that I think kind of Western science, if we're going to talk about it that way, and Indigenous knowledge systems come together is around this very topic of place. And I think it's one of the areas that, like, ecology as a discipline lends itself particularly well to, because our languages and our cultures and our laws all come from our lands. And we are people who come from our lands. I'm a person who comes from salmon. And so there is a really, really important, there is like you cannot separate, you know, like our names, our languages come from like our place names, and that is really, really critical. And so I think that when we are talking about relationships to specific areas and to specific regions and to specific lands and waters, there is this natural opportunity for us to investigate and learn and relate to one another using these kinds of different ways of knowing, or using Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. I think that some of the opportunities that I see happening right now, and in some of the work that I've done, have been a little bit of an interplay. So maybe not always a coming together, but a feeding off of one another. So I think one example, I can think of a couple examples related to the work I've done on clam gardens or sea gardens in my territory and in the Southern Gulf Islands. And so one of those is when we began doing restoration work, this restoration work, so clam gardens, for those of you who may not know, are beaches that have been tended by people for thousands of years. And they're characterized by a rock wall along the low tide line. And they shift the slope of the beach, and they increase the available habitat for clams, and also for all sorts of other intertidal species. And when we started restoring clam gardens, as led by 9 Halkanium and Wasanish nations, we thought that they were for clams. And then as we have continued to bring people back onto the beaches again, and we've been sharing stories and sharing foods and spending time with one another and studying how our ecosystems are changing, we're realizing that it's not just clams that are making their homes here. There are kelp forests that are living along the rock walls. There are urchins, and there are chitons, and there are this whole suite of different species. And our elders talk about these places not as clam gardens, but as seafood gardens. These are places we go to care for not only clams, and to harvest not only clams, but also this entire suite of other foods. And so I think that this example feels really poignant to me right now, because although it may not be an example of where, it's an example of where there are these kind of meeting places where different kind of knowledge systems and ways of investigating and understanding the natural world can feed off of one another and help us have a more complete understanding of the ecosystems and the systems that we live within. So I think that that's one way that Western science and worldviews are coming together more often.
Yeah, and Terry, just as a little preface, I wonder if you can also include in your response sort of taking us back into the historically too. So I'm just going to drop that in, because you're sort of starting with the Aldo Leopold tradition, things like that.
Okay, I think first I'd like to start with a story that Skye's comments reminded me of. I began my scientific career as very much a reductionist scientist. I wanted to know how it was that temperature influenced the physiology of the roots of wetland plants along a temperature gradient between Utqiagvik in northern Alaska and Death Valley in California. And I gradually learned that these plants were so well adapted to temperature that temperature didn't really matter to them. They could function just fine at the temperatures where each of those populations lived. But if I wanted to understand how plants got their nutrients, what I really needed to understand was the relationship between the decomposition of organic matter by microbes in the rooting zone, which would release nutrients. And basically the roots would take up all the nutrients that the plants, that the microbes would provide. So I needed to have that ecosystem context in order to understand the physiology of the plants. And then as time went on, I began to realize that people were having such a huge effect on the world environment that if I really wanted to understand how plants were behaving in today's world and how they're likely to behave in the future, I needed to understand the relationship between people and nature. And so that got me interested in the issue of stewardship. And so now I want to stop and just tell you a little story about a visit that I had. I was interested in climate change research for a long time and became good friends with some of the people from Huslia, an Athabascan village in Northwest Alaska. And they were concerned about climate change. So they invited several of us from the University of Alaska to go there and have a conversation with them and to share stories and observations about climate change. So when we got there, Orville took me to visit his auntie and uncle, and his uncle had just come in from harvesting a beaver, and that was sitting over in the corner waiting to be skinned. And Catherine offered us a cup of tea, and Orville explained to her that we were there to talk to people about climate change. And so she talked a bit about how things had changed since she grew up there in the north, and how much warmer it was, and some of the effects that had on their lives. But then she very quickly changed the conversation to talk about the beaver that Stephen had harvested that day. And she talked about how they use every piece of that beaver. We have to respect the beaver. We have to use everything that's there. We need to make sure that we don't harvest too many beavers so that it'll be there in the future. And we're able to live in these lands because we respect nature, because we respect the animals and the plants with which we interact. And later on, when we got into conversations with other members of the community, Catherine's sort of brought up the issue. One of her main points was, it's all connected. We can't do just one thing and expect it to be and have just the effects of what we directly do, but it's all connected. And that's exactly the same thing that I had learned much more painstakingly, and she explained it so much more clearly to me than I had been able to learn from books and from Western science. So I could see that there were a lot of things in common between Indigenous science and Western science. And I've always learned a lot from the people that I've walked around with at the various villages. I love doing that. But it's not the same. There's a much more spiritual dimension of Indigenous science, at least as it's been explained to me, than there is for Western science. As a Western scientist, I was trained to be objective and not to say anything that I couldn't document in facts. And so my conversations with other people and even with general audiences were always about the facts, which I tried to explain in terms of reasoning and logic why nature was important, why science was important. But I never thought to connect with the heart. And that's what makes people care about nature. That's what makes people care about the kinds of things that you and I are talking about today. It's because it really connects to them here. And that's what's important. So I also learned that it's really important to learn how to tell stories about the connections between people and nature. I want to just say one other thing. David mentioned this book that I wrote. It's about grassroots stewardship. And it's really, it took me 2 or 3 years to write it because I'd never tried writing for a general audience, but I learned a lot in the process of doing it. And it gave me some framework to think about how these things that you and I are talking about here today are really important to everybody in the world. The future of nature really is in our hands, just like that picture suggests. And so we've we've got to figure out how to do it. And so this book is about that. And if there's time later on, I can explain something more about that. But I've learned so much from spending time in nature with people from the villages. And I think the connections between Indigenous science and Western science, I learned so much from Indigenous science, much more than I think they've learned from Western science or from me.
I'd like to just pick up on something you said, which was about the spiritual dimension of Indigenous science. And I know that you spent some time with, was it the Aldo Leopold Institute, and you speak about his writings as sort of the father of ecology in the United States. And he was a very spiritual person. His writings are very spiritual. Do you think that, and I want both of you to address this, do you think that Western science is becoming more spiritual as a result of scientists being so well informed by these experiences with more an Indigenous science worldview?
I think some of us are being dragged kicking and screaming out of the ivory tower, whether we want to or not. But I honestly think that it's much more important to be able to tell stories, to appreciate this spiritual dimension. Aldo Leopold often explained to it more as in a sense of a moral responsibility, a responsibility of being a citizen of the world, citizen of the planet. And basically most of his stories in his book about the Sand County Almanac are basically telling the same story that I learned from Catherine. It's all connected, and we do things to nature and nature does things to us. And if we do bad things to nature, we're going to suffer in the long term. And so it's understanding these interconnections, this reciprocity between what we do and and the benefits and the bads that we get from nature when we misbehave. So I think there's a very strong moral and spiritual dimension to the way I think about connecting to nature and the way I think about doing my Western science. I become one of the things, this interest in stewardship that I have is really fairly strongly spiritually grounded. One of the things I do now as a volunteer is work with the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, which is a local group that tries to find various ways to take action to reduce rates of climate change. And one of the groups that I work with most actively is the Interfaith Working Group. And we work with, we get together with various churches and groups of faith in the Fairbanks area. And one of my goals in working with that group is to work with a variety of different kinds of churches that range from quite liberal to quite conservative. And I'm particularly interested in connecting with evangelical congregations and with some of the more conservative congregations, with groups that are outside of the Christian tradition, because I think that gives me a broader picture of the spiritual dimensions of our connections to the world. And I also feel like there's ways that we can bridge this disconnect, this political polarization that's happening by talking about things that we have in common. Our care for God's creation, as they might describe it, our care for vulnerable people. That's something that I think everybody can connect with in one way or another. And we don't need to get out on the barricades in terms of a combative relationship across a polarized landscape. I think we can find common ground where we can have a much more meaningful conversation if we speak from the heart.
So Skye, you're a different generation scientist. Did you have the same difficulty having emotional and spiritual attachment to the land, or is it a much different world than say Terry was in as a student?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that as a young scientist, I think I feel much more comfortable with the interplay of spirituality and science in my life than I did when I first started out. when I first started out, I was incredibly overwhelmed by the need to try to access, I guess, this objectivity. But I think what we also, the other piece of that is a removal of yourself from the system. And this idea that we, like, as humans, are not actually a part of these systems, but we are like disproportionately and only negatively impacting any of the like earth systems that we interact with. And that just isn't the truth and hasn't always been the truth. And so I think that as I have found different new mentors and different communities and really and strengthened my own kind of confidence in my career, then this interplay has felt a little bit more comfortable for me. So, and I guess I see people around me scientists around me become more comfortable with words like ritual or ceremony. And that makes me really excited, because I think that one of the biggest changes that I believe we need to see happen is remembering that we are a part of these ecosystems. And exactly like you're talking about, Terry, the things that, you know, we put out, we are also receiving because we are also animals, and we are also part of creation, and we have a responsibility to look after our brothers and sisters on the beaches and in the oceans and in our forests.
And Skye, you've been working on the Clam Garden Stewardship Project. Are there other projects that you'd like to kind of highlight and so that can sort of demonstrate and encapsulate all the ideas that you've been sort of expressing?
I mean, I think that the Sea Gardens work is one of the ones that does it best, because I think that when we're talking about restoring places like sea gardens, we're not just talking about ecological restoration, we're also talking about restoring people's connections with territory and with land. And we're also talking about restoring, just as we are in this conversation, connections between generations and between ways of knowing and between these ancestral practices that have carried us through since time immemorial and through millennia, and what we're looking for, like, and the restoration, which naturally implies this creation for future generations. And so we're talking about how we can learn from our past and use it to create you know, a really vibrant and diverse and life for, you know, the clams and the octopus and the kids. And I've recently been, I've done just the other day, I've been thinking a lot about 7 generations and about our responsibility to, you know, be good ancestors, and thinking about when is 7 generations from now, because, like, what is the world that we're trying to create? But also thinking as a recipient. And so, you know, we are recipients in whatever lands we're joining from tonight, of the vision and intention and stewardship of our ancestors. And so I think that it was about maybe 7 generations ago, when I was born, like, that the first settlers settled on Vancouver Island. And, you know, one of the questions I've been asking myself is this the world that they were imagining for us, that our ancestors 7 generations ago were imagining for us? And what is the world that we want to leave? And I think that is, I hope that the world that we're leaving is one where we get to receive all of the gifts that we are giving to the natural world.
That's a pretty powerful thought. Just thinking, my grandchildren will be 7th generation living in this little area right by the Russell Island Clam Gardens, and what what did those ancestors think about? And it's a mixed bag, I can tell you, because some of them were artists and some of them were naturalists and some of them were, you know, capitalists and everything else. So, and I think that you share a similar, Terry, you share a similar lineages, and I'm wondering, you know, same sort of question, if there's some stewardship projects that you've been involved in that really kind of encapsulate all these, the spiritual dimensions, the bridging of, as you say, whether it's the faith communities, generations. Is there some up in Alaska that can give us some good inspiration down here in the islands?
Well, there's one project that I learned about through a meeting that I went to that really inspired me. It was the Yukon River, the salmon populations in the Yukon River have been declining for about 15 or 20 years. And the situation has gotten so serious that there's severe restrictions on salmon harvest. And most of the villages in the Yukon River Basin, which extends all the way from the west coast of Alaska well into Canada, there were representatives from all of the villages there that came together to try to figure out what to do about how to manage the salmon populations. And they'd traditionally been fighting with each other. There were bitter feuds where the downriver villages blamed the upriver villages for using fish wheels that caught too many salmons and prevented them from getting to the spawning ground. And the upriver villages blamed the downriver villages for harvesting fish commercially and selling them more above what they needed for their own personal use. And the Canadian villages blamed the Alaskan villages for taking more than their share of salmon, so that the United States was never able to meet its treaty obligations to Canada. And everybody blamed the cod fishery in the ocean for taking salmon as bycatch and throwing them overboard. And so this group, and because of all of this disagreement, there was never any effective tribal management of salmon or agreement about how tribal management of salmon could work. And so it was managed by the state and federal fisheries management agencies. And so this meeting started out with people from various villages standing up and talking about how important salmon was to their lives. And then this elder from Canada stood up and said, we're salmon people. And we've always been salmon people. But I haven't fished for salmon for 10 years because I'm afraid that if we fish for salmon, the salmon will go away and we'll never have salmon again. So instead, I fly to Juneau and buy expensive salmon that are caught from the ocean. And then her grandson stood up and said, I'm 18 years old. I've always gone up and down the river. We go to fish camp every year, but I've never fished for salmon, even though I know we're salmon people, because I know it's so important to protect those salmon so they'll come back. And after he sat down, you could have heard a pin drop in that large room. And the next day, they agreed on a moratorium to stop fishing all along the Yukon River in all the villages for a year to see if the salmon couldn't begin to recover. And and there were, of course, some people that did fish for salmon, but most people didn't. They really respected that. And they also began a process of developing an intertribal fish commission that was a collaborative effort by the state of Alaska Department of Fisheries and tribal groups up and down the river. And they've been managing the salmon fishery since then. And the next year, there were enough that woman from Canada and her grandson were able to fish for salmon again. Now, that was just a year of high run. It wasn't as if it suddenly recovered. But they came together around the spirituality of salmon and the recognition that they were salmon people. They were protecting the salmon because they understood the importance of Western science and understood that the populations were declining and that they had to be protected. And then they took responsibility as citizens of the Yukon River, as citizens of the planet, to do something about it. And that's the sort of thing that inspires me now, that each of us is a citizen of the planet, and each of us needs to find ways in which we, in our own individual ways, can do something to make the planet a better place, and to make our own special place that we particularly appreciate a better place. And so those are the kinds of things that get me excited now, this whole notion of stewardship and shaping a more sustainable future for our planet.
So you raise a really important question, which is, whether we try and change things as communities, or we try and go farther up the river and have make big major systemic changes. What do you think are the most important changes that are needed to advance a more effective and a more just outcome as these environmental issues intensify? And maybe I'll put that to Skye. Just an easy little question.
How to solve everything. I feel like there are so many kind of places that we can begin. And I think one of those places is remembering and learning how to be good hosts and good visitors. And I mean that kind of in our own communities, but I also mean that in territories. How do we live in the places that we live, in the families, in the communities, and on the lands, with that kind of respect, with that gratitude, and with the desire to have those places continue to be able to welcome people. And I feel like there's a little bit of a lost art there that I see some people kind of reclaiming in this strange 2020 year, as we have opportunities to remember what home means in different ways, I think, for lots of folks. I think that we also need to continue to learn how to draw on all of the different ways of knowing, as we've been talking about tonight, and that we have available to us, because the challenges, as I think everyone in this community is aware, our challenges are large and complex and multifaceted and daunting. And we need the most creative, innovative, courageous solutions and leadership. And I personally believe that comes when we are able to use all of the wisdom that we have at our have available. And so that means learning from, Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. And I think that personally, as humans, that requires that we be a little bit willing to be uncomfortable, because it means that we have to be willing to have our minds be changed and to sit with difference, and none of those things are comfortable. And so I think that maybe I'll summarize by saying, I think that two things that we can do is try to remember how to be good visitors and get comfortable sitting in discomfort.
I think Skye hit several nails right on the head. I agree with everything that you said there. I particularly like your starting point, that there's so many ways in which we can make a difference, so many places where we can improve things, so many pathways to making things better. The flip side of having a bad situation is that there's a lot of ways to make it better. And I also really believe what you said about the importance of having a respectful relationship with one another and with nature. And that goes a long way. Even though I guess it's a daunting issue because it's a global problem, and the challenges to having a more sustainable planet are massive. And yet I'm increasingly feel that the most important place to start is with individual people, individual families, individual communities, because that's the level at which we know nature. That's the level at which we know one another. And if we just say, well, this is a problem for government to fix, they've got no motivations to fix the problems unless the voters and the people who are their constituents come to them and insist that, come on, get to work, do the right thing. So it all comes back to individual people. And I think there's lots of different ways that we can approach this. I think connecting with nature at a personal level, like we were talking about earlier, is really important, just so that we have a respect for nature and believe that these issues are worth addressing. I think we also need to learn how to live more lightly on the planet. An average person in the United States or other developed nations uses on average 32 times more resources per person than someone living in a developing nation. And first of all, that's not quite fair. But more importantly, it means that we can be 32 times more effective in reducing our footprint on the planet by respectful patterns of consumption. There's also lots of inequity among groups of people in developed nations. So it's not as if everybody can dial back their consumption, but there's many of us who are in a good position to be able to do that. I think there's also ways in which we can communicate more effectively with one another and take advantage of our social networks. Each one of us has a social network that's different than anyone else's. So each of us can communicate effectively with a group of people that none of the rest of us can communicate with. So each of us is unique in the kinds of things we can do. Each of us is unique in the passions we bring to the issue. Each of us is different in the level of commitment that we might have to doing these things. But I think the important thing is just to step up and do it. And beyond individual actions, I think it requires respectful communications with others and willingness to listen to others, even though on the surface, these might be people with whom we deeply disagree. It's also important to collaborate and do things together and to take political action and protest when things get out of hand.
I loved your reference to getting involved with the interfaith community and reaching out across the political and religious isolated islands. And that sort of takes me to the final question. Just so everyone knows, we're going to have one last question for our wonderful speakers and then open it up to people that would like to contribute or a question. So my final question is really about, you mentioned about our individual unique contributions. And I actually had a question here, which was, what are the unique contributions that islands and islanders make? We're in a very kind of special place as an island for many reasons, even sort of evolutionarily. And also in these remote communities where you are, Terry, up in Alaska, you've got islands of communities. And is there a unique contribution that islands bring? And I'm going to start with Skye, because her work is focused on a very tiny little island that is probably the dearest island to my own heart. And I feel that it is a great place of learning and power. So I'm going to pass it to you.
Absolutely. Oh, and Russell Island is probably the place dearest to my heart too, Briony. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, islands are, I think, these like microcosms that we can kind of treat as these experimental grounds to do things differently. And I think that that's true of some of those like small islands like you and I are talking about, Briony, but also some of the bigger islands. And that holds true whether you are looking at islands from like a cultural perspective or from an ecological perspective. And so I think that, yeah, I think that we have these opportunities to try things out and see how they work and adjust what we're doing, and really treat some of our islands as experiments of new ways of relating to one another, relating to our ecosystems, of caring for these places. The beaches that we were talking about before everyone else joined, you know, some of those beaches are thousands of years old, have been looked after for since the time of the pyramids. And like that would have started as an experiment. And so I think like we need to not forget that we have that agency today.
Beautiful. And Terry, up in your beautiful Alaskan island of beauty.
You know, these islands are not so small, actually. Indigenous people are the predominant residents and stewards of 25% of the terrestrial land surface. It's mostly lands that are remote from cities, that have very little human infrastructure. It's the areas with the largest biodiversity on the planet. It's the areas that really are the protected, that really are some of the nicest examples of nature. And so I think if people who in these places who are stewarding the lands where they live and on which they depend, if these people can network with one another and learn from one another, from the kinds of experiments and observations that, like the ones Skye described, I think there's huge potential to have a global impact on the future of nature and the future of biodiversity on the planet, as well as to learn how to live spiritually in common with nature and respectfully with nature in a reciprocal relationship. So it's not unimportant. It's a big deal.
Wonderful. Okay, now our very our host is going to field some questions, or at least introduce the questions, and I'll field them. Dave.
All right, am I back?
You're back.
All right, cool. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that. We're getting some great questions flowing in here. So what I'll do is lob them out, and Briony, you can help facilitate the answers if Skye and Terry get too scrappy.
Been really scrappy with each other.
The first question comes from Pierre, who asks, this came out of the part of the discussion about spirituality and the interspiritual work you're doing in Fairbanks, Terry, I think. Pierre asks, given the spiritual nature of environmental appreciation that you describe, how do you reconcile the attitude of current right-wing evangelical adherents that seem to be more intent on domination over nature, or using it all up before Armageddon? This seems to be a major issue in US politics today and perhaps beyond.
I think that's a really interesting question. One of the things that's interesting, if you look at various statements by faith groups and major religions about their opinions about climate change, is that most of those faith groups are very supportive of climate change research and climate change action. One of my favorite groups to work with is the Evangelical Environmental Network. They've got a fantastic statement about the commitment that their group has to care for God's creation and vulnerable people. And they make a very strong point of saying, your religion should guide your politics. Don't let your politics shape your religion. And I think if we can have conversations at that level and get down to the basic goals and values that we might share across that political spectrum of religions, or to the spectrum of worldviews that are differentially represented in different faith communities, then I think we've got a chance to deal with that. But I think the best, a good starting point is to start from where they come from. What is the perspective of those different religious groups about their religion and their view of their relationship to nature and to people?
Skye, did you want to tackle that one, or should we move on? That was great, Terry.
Yeah, that was awesome. I think the only thing that I'll add is, I think that it's really important that we think carefully about the stories that we tell ourselves and each other. And I think that we can look to some like our creation stories. We can look to a lot of kind of the stories that are the center of a lot of our spirituality and religions. And I think to do so, and so I think it's important that we are careful.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So the next question is from Anne, and she's ripping off the story that Terry told about people in Alaska backing off of salmon resource extraction. And she asks, can anyone suggest something to read or watch on the subject of spiritual connection or reconnection with nature by white Europeans, and why this aspect was lost in the first place? She observes hunter-gatherers or subsistence communities are tied to the environment more inherently because it's food, shelter, and spirituality. White Europeans, with their diaspora and ostensibly objective science, seem to have disconnected. So she's asking about this notion of devolution or de-evolution by Europeans.
That's a good question. I don't know that literature. I should. It sounds very much like the literature of the things that Aldo Leopold wrote. And he certainly goes back to can trace his roots back from there. My impression is that local people often have a really tight and respectful relationship with nature. So if you go back to small fishing communities in the British Isles or in Europe or Africa, I think there's that same sort of close relationship to nature. Not always with everybody, not always with every community, but you can often find those things.
I just wanted to say, Terry, that the book that I worked on, which is a historical book, which was really about Aldo Leopold's the tradition, the lineage stemming all the way back to the 1700s. That attachment to nature, the spiritual relationship to nature, was constantly suppressed by government and other religious forces, because it was in counter to resource developments, or it was a very, very trackable suppression.
So that's all during the period of the Industrial Revolution, when governments had a strong vested interest in extraction.
Yeah, there's
and
quite a lot of.
I must say that I really it's so unfortunate, the colonialist history of North America, and this notion in the United States of manifest destiny, of going out and taking nature wherever you go, and feeling that it's your right to take nature, is a perspective that I find deeply disturbing.
And then
Skye, do you want to wade in?
Yeah, go for it, Skye. And then I have some stuff in the chat to share too in response to Anne's question.
I don't know if I have a book to recommend. I think that we can't really separate these topics from like imperialism. And I think that, when we see imperialism come to North America, that's when we see this same kind of disconnection move here too.
And in the chat, this is the beauty of this type of community here. Everly has chimed in and suggests reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, a great Indigenous writer and scholar books on my shelf over here. Evie Witten writes in from Anchorage and suggests anything by Hugh Brody, including The Other Side of Eden. So there's a lot of good stuff out there, and I can personally recommend the new biography of Richard Nelson, who lived many years in Alaska, originally from Leopold Land in Wisconsin, and the new biography is called Raven's Witness.
Yeah, great. And just to reiterate, the real thing really looks at the Canadian and American origin of that that suppressing of people, right to the extent where they were forming secret societies. And that's where all the Leopold's stories came from, was out of the secret society that was formed just to very express their spirituality. It's a very poignant story. Okay, Dave.
Sacred Ecology by Fikret Berkes is another really good book that sort of brings Western science to bear on Indigenous stewardship.
Cool, thank you. So the next question in the chat comes from Michael, who says, I'm wondering if anyone heard the discussion on CBC radio today about finding water on the moon, and how the response of NASA was so apparently contrary to an Indigenous viewpoint. They were wondering how they would, quote, exploit it without even mentioning the miracle of the finding. Is this a typical settler viewpoint? How do we reconcile this disconnect? Any ideas on that?
Well, this is a fun question. I want to hear more. I missed this.
I missed it too. I think Michael might have been hallucinating on the job. It might not be a real story, but let's assume it was for the moment.
Terry, I loved your story about the man in the moon, one of the Athabascan elders pointing to the man in the moon. That seems appropriate for this moment.
Yeah, well, when we were having this discussion in Huslia about climate change, and this elder stood up and said, it all started when people went to the moon. Ever since then, the world went to hell in a handbasket, and everything's fallen apart. Everything's gotten worse since then. So it's really that's the fault. And there were several of us that scientists that come there, including some anthropologists, and afterwards we sat down and talked for a couple of hours about where that statement come from. Did he really want us to believe that people going to the moon would have caused all of the climate change and all of the other things that are happening, or was it something else? And I guess my feeling at the end of the day was that he was saying it's our disrespect for spiritual objects that is just a symptom of the way in which we treat nature. And we have to have a much more respectful relationship with nature if we expect to have a sustainable future and good outcomes for society.
Great, thanks for that, Terry. One more book recommendation comes from Tara Martin, and the recommendation is Briony Penn's own new book, Following the Good River, her biography of Cecil Paul and with Cecil Paul. So check that one out too. Tina poses a question, starting with a comment. She says, I really love the idea of starting to focus more on the positive things we can do and really hold up and promote the people who do those things. She says, we need positive trailblazers badly. And she poses the question specifically to Skye. I'm keenly interested in learning more about how you connect with your own generation on these issues. I have so much confidence in Skye's generation to lead the way.
The question is, how do I connect with my own generation?
Yeah, and help inspire trailblazing and leadership and optimism in your generation, given all the negative news out there.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. I think that one thing that's different about, I suppose, my generations and generations that come after is that we have grown up with an awareness that the challenges that we face are immense and overwhelming. And I think that I feel like the most important thing that I can do is, for myself anyway, is maintain a sense of like optimism and hope, because that's the only way that anything's ever going to get better, is if we believe that we can improve and like create a better life. And so but it doesn't feel very difficult to me, because I think that there are so many incredible examples and so many amazing projects, along our coast that are those trailblazers and that are doing things incredibly differently, and that are being led by people who understand the significance and the urgency. And so I feel like there's so many examples of work being done with abandon and just like this this courageousness. We see fish weirs being restored in Celtic territory, and we have sea gardens being restored. Like, they're popping up all over, up and down the coast. And it was less than 10 years ago that a lot of people in British Columbia had never heard of a clam garden or a sea garden before. So I think that there's an appetite for optimism, and so for me, I think that the best thing we can do is just issue invitations and focus our energy on projects that provide ourselves with inspiration.
I totally agree with you that it's important to be optimistic and to focus on the positive opportunities rather than trying to blame people for what the problems are. And one of the things that makes me most optimistic about the future is the youth climate marches that have been inspired by Greta Thunberg and others. Those people are just amazing. They're going out there and saying, if you're not going to do anything, we're going to take it over, and we're going to make these things happen. My grandkids took me to one of those climate marches, and I loved it.
That's great. Thank you both. The next question comes from Susan, and she asks, one other person asked this too, are there differences in how people who live in the wilderness or rural areas can steward resources compared to those who live in the city? And then the follow-up is, should city dwellers subsidize the protection of biodiversity and natural places? Or is it the other way around?
I think it's this new dynamic between cities and rural areas is a really interesting thing. The fact that rural areas are being depopulated, on the surface of it, seems like just a wonderful opportunity to restore nature. And yet people are losing their livelihoods at the same time. And so, since nature and people have a reciprocal relationship, that livelihood piece needs to somehow get figured out. And city people certainly depend on rural places for all of their resources. And they often depend on those rural places as their cultural roots and their understanding of how to live with and appreciate nature. So I think there's lots of opportunities, but I don't see a real clear strategy for how to put all of that together. So I agree, it's a big challenge.
What do you think, Skye?
I mean, I feel like this question's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I think that if the way that I approach this is that we can all do things within wherever we live to maintain a connection to the ecosystems that we're in, and to kind of contribute to the restoration and flourishing of the region more largely, more broadly. And so I think that the most important thing is that we all kind of take some responsibility and ownership for the place that we are, and the family that we're in, and the community that we're in. and do what we can from that position. I think that if we're in if we are in positions to look to contribute to areas outside of our own ecosystem and family and community, how can we do that in solidarity with with the really good work that is happening in those places, because there is really good work happening in all of our places.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just take co-host prerogative here, I guess a lot of my work is way up north in big quote unquote wild places like the Great Bear, like the Canadian Arctic, like Alaska. And yet when I hang out with Indigenous friends in places like California, a single US state with 40 million people, more than all of Canada, I am always reminded that there is rich Indigenous history and rich contemporary Indigenous activity, even in a place that's overrun by stuff like Los Angeles. And so I think anywhere on this continent and in many other parts of the world, one can establish that rootedness, even if one lives in something that looks like a sprawly suburb.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, this is great. Next question. No softballs here. So the next question is from Mina Lee, and she says, ecosystems and stewardship are all well and good, but I do not think that Indigenous people historically necessarily lived under our kinds of concepts of private property and fences and roads and things like that. Is there any way to change this, she says? So I guess it's maybe a question about, bridge building between perceptions of Western history, perceptions of Indigenous history. Are there concepts of stewardship that relate to taking care of places that are kind of like property? Is that as much of a divide as it appears?
Okay, good question. I'm going to jump in here. I mean, I can only speak for my community, like where I'm from and my experiences, but I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around Indigenous communities in this area, and of us as being like hunter-gatherers, for instance, and we've been active stewards and protector and caretakers of lands and waters for millennia, and often those responsibilities can be handed down in families, and I think that there's and this might be what this question's getting at, there's a pretty big difference between the sense of responsibility that we have for looking after a place and that kind of responsibility being handed down in your family than there is with Western ownership, because it isn't a permissive right to kind of take anything or extract whatever you need, but it is a place that you are responsible for, exactly like we're talking stewarding or caretaking. And I think it's that sense of responsibility that is the most distinct. But I also think that that is something that we can cultivate within ourselves in any of the places that we live. We don't need to own lands to be responsible for them. And I might argue, nor should we.
Terry, do you want to chime in on that one, or?
No, that was a beautiful answer.
Great. Thanks so much, Skye. Okay.
Dave, I had just one little thing to add that
Go for it.
seemed appropriate, is that the trust, the legal tool of trust is the closest thing that has been described to creating the conditions for Indigenous governance models. And so it seemed appropriate to interject just to say that the Salt Spring Conservancy is under a trust model, and it's got the ability, according to Richard Overstall, who's one of the very well-known Indigenous lawyers, that it has the ability to create the conditions for traditional forms of governance, because the terms of the trust are set by the trustees. So it's why some of the models like the Hutsik Kuk Society has been very successful, because it's a form of land holding and governance that is still within the Western model, but can operate under traditional forms of governance.
I suppose kind of building off of that, I think there's lots of examples of Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada and around the world that are doing exactly that, like trying to reassert or are reasserting traditional forms of governance, ancestral forms of governance in and land and laws in place in this context where we have kind of fee simple lands.
And there's the Indigenous Laws Research Unit at the University of Victoria Law School, which is all about harmonizing and fronting Indigenous legal orders and legal systems with Crown law.
Yeah, they're doing amazing work.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so the next question comes from Chris here on Salt Spring, and this is something that really links climate change, Salt Spring Island, and Alaska, and many other places in the West. And Chris asks, how do we include wildfire risk reduction in land stewardship, which is a special concern here on this island, but given recent summers in Alaska and the whole North American West, it's a concern, and Australia, it's a concern all over the place.
That's a wonderful question. And I think one thing about stewardship at a time of rapid and turbulent change is that we can't try to put things back to the way they were. The climate warming is so far, it has accelerated so much that we're going to live with that for a long time to come. And so I think we need to recognize that fire regime will change, and often in ways that are incompatible with current zoning regulations and certain development patterns that have come to be expected in places like the United States. I can't speak for Canada, but for example, most of the cost of fighting wildfires in the United States is protecting structures that are built in unsafe places. An alternative would be to concentrate development in more nuclear communities and surround those communities with open lands, whether those are agricultural lands or golf courses or some other type of land that has a low amounts of fuel, so that those communities can be more readily protected. So I think part of stewardship going forward in a changing climate means finding new ways to do new things to accomplish the deeper objectives of finding ways that people and nature can live together.
Great. Okay, so now we pop up to Anchorage, and John Shane asks, Aldo Leopold's first principle of conservation was to save all the parts. How do we help our community members recognize this important principle?
Go ahead, Skye. I think you've got a lot of experience in doing just that.
Saving all the parts. Whew. I think that part of that is changing the stories that we tell allowing them to involve more characters, so that we learn to recognize the importance of all of the different parts that we're trying to save. I also think that, kind of, if I scale out a little bit, we need to be thinking about resilience and how do we foster resilience within our ecosystems and our communities. And so some of that might be making sure that we're saving all the parts, but we're also living in a little bit of a different context than Aldo Leopold was. And so we might need to think a little bit more about different principles, like, habitat redundancy and complexity and some of these different things, because if we're talking about ecosystems, some of our species are moving into and out of the places that we're used to seeing them. And so I guess I wonder if saving all of the parts is always going to get us the same result that it might have in the past. One example that I can think of right now is, we're trying to make sure that all of the species in sea gardens are present, and not all of them are present in the densities that we need them. But we also have policies that prevent that from taking place right now. And so, if there are parts of our systems that are missing, are there barriers that we have created that we can address to try to remedy that?
It seems like at a global scale, we're doing a pretty bad job so far, and largely through habitat destruction and conversion of wild lands to agriculture. And if these sort of trends continue, interacting with climate change, we're likely to lose another 10% of the species before the end of the century, and that's going to come back and bite us. So I think we need to think carefully about ways to change our attitude about how much development we allow. How can we conserve areas that can continue to maintain a natural relationship between species and environment? I think inevitably some species will continue to go extinct, just as they always have been, but that's happening much too quickly now as a result of human impacts on the environment. So if we can find ways to dial back our impacts on broad areas, especially in remote areas, which is where Indigenous communities have the greatest knowledge and experience, then I think there's a good possibilities of protecting many of those species. But I don't think we're going to be 100% successful.
Great. So I just want to pause and do a little time check here. It's 8:02 p.m. Pacific time. And if anybody needs to leave, feel free to do that. I realize it's late for people, especially east of here. Otherwise, we have at least a few more questions in the queue and lots more good ideas to discuss, so we can keep going for a bit longer, up till 8:30, before we should let our speakers get a bit of rest in their voices and their minds, which have been active tonight. So feel free to take off. Otherwise, we'll just keep going with a smaller group. So these questions don't ever get to softball territory. So Rachel, I think in Alberta, says, thanks for a great event. We were hoping the speakers could comment on overpopulation and whether this is a conversation we're missing at a systemic level, or if there's more important things than that particular issue as framed that way.
I think that's a really important issue, and I think, at least for me, it depends, how I would address that would depend on who I was having the conversation with. Regardless of how you had this conversation, I think it's important to put this conversation in a positive framework as much as possible. It's clear that rising human population has been one of the, probably the major, that and consumption per capita have been the major drivers of environmental change. So it's clearly something that's problematic. However, in many developed nations, the population is no longer rising. When people move to cities, they often choose to have fewer children because children become a burden to families rather than a source of insurance for old age. And so I think there's ways in which the dynamic is gradually changing, but not changing rapidly enough. In developing nations, the intervention that's been most successful in reducing population growth has been general education of girls, not education about population issues or birth control or anything like that, but just general education, because then they realize that there's other worlds out there that they might consider, and they take a more active role in planning their future. Now that's something that's positive no matter how you look at it. If girls have more opportunities to influence their future and their fate and where they want to go with their lives, that's a good thing. And you don't need to justify that in terms of population growth. In every country, it seems that unwanted pregnancies are become personal tragedies at many levels. And so there's many different ways that different groups are prepared to have that conversation about how they might plan their family size. And so I tend to feel that in the conversations that I feel comfortable having, I'd like to reduce the likelihood of unwanted pregnancies, but leave it to the individuals involved to decide how they're going to do that, rather than my trying to dictate what their response is to be. But the continued rise in population is continuing to put pressure on our planet, and the more the population rises, the more we've got to take more drastic actions in other dimensions to reduce the total human impact on the planet.
Skye, do you want to add anything on the population question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a big can of worms, and I think that to me this feels like it's tied very tightly to a question of equity. And I think that when we're talking about population, when we talk about overpopulation, often I find those conversations are centered in kind of the G10, G12 countries, and they're also centered in countries that house the corporations that are responsible for the vast bulk of our greenhouse gas emissions and for climate change. And when we're talking about overpopulation, we largely are looking at, like Terry's pointing out, countries that are not causing a lot of the kind of problems that we're addressing. And so I don't know that we can talk about population without also talking about equity. And I think that we have a responsibility to take to clean up the mess in our own backyards. And I think that is the most important thing. And so if we take, if we try to hold account the corporations that are based in North America for, and not just for our country's kind of emissions and contributions to those things, I think that's the most effective thing that we can do.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for tackling that. The next question is also a bit of a doozy, and you'll both have responses to this. This comes from Fred in Sitka, Alaska. And Fred says, in the so-called Western world, spiritual has a negative connotation as being lesser than facts. Indigenous science is spiritual to non-natives. It sounds to them like belief or something, stories versus facts. But facts are conclusions that can often change, even politically, like time zones in Alaska. We now have 1 instead of 4, which we used to have. Herring are not considered a forage fish, so they aren't considered endangered, and therefore unsustainable herring fisheries allowed. So he says, indigenous scientists don't believe, they know. They know from centuries of observation, of data and evidence. Newton got an idea when an apple fell on his head. If he was indigenous, perhaps gravity would be called just a story. Goes on to observe that Western science and quantum mechanics, the stuff about speed of light, spin, particle theory, all starts to border on the spiritual. And finally, he concludes by saying, it reminds me of the unfortunate current use of the word tribal in the media to mean groupthink. So any reactions to any of that rich bundle of stuff, a lot of which centers around language?
One thought that I have, just based on my own experience, is that science does depend a lot on observations of what you can observe at a moment in time. But the contributions of science depend largely on the understanding and the wisdom that come out of those observations. The facts themselves are not really very important. And I know that when I do my own science, the hardest part of that, but the most exciting part, is basically trying to develop a story that's consistent with the observations, both the things I've observed and the things that other people have observed. And so although most scientists would shy away from the claim that they're telling stories, I think that the quintessential value of science is in telling meaningful stories. We just don't call them stories. And some of the papers that I find most frustrating to read are ones that are a litany of facts without a storyline. And most of those types of papers get read a few times and then put on the shelf. But it's the ones that have a compelling story that really contribute. And that's not that different to the way in which Indigenous observations get incorporated into stories, and some of the best stories get remembered as wisdom. And so I think there's some really strong parallels there, that perhaps more similarity than difference, even though most Western scientists would shy away from admitting that they're telling stories.
And Terry, kind of building off of that, I think that is what I see kind of preventing, like as a bit of a barrier sometimes to understanding each other better, because this idea that we are speaking fact or we as scientists are speaking fact without recognizing that there is a position that we are approaching these data and facts from, and that there is a story that we're telling with this, and that there are values associated with the story that we are telling. And we often associate those values and things with Indigenous knowledge. But often what we're doing are using all of the values associated with positivism when we're engaging in Western science. So I think that the comments that are all pretty astute. I think that we have lots of different ways of ascribing meaning and sharing stories, and we just don't always see those as being equal. It's more of a power imbalance, I think, often than anything.
Brilliant.
I don't think this is restricted to conversations between Indigenous and Western scientists. I think the same thing happens when there's conversations across academic disciplines, or differences in conversations, or conversations between practitioners and scientists, or practitioners and people of faith. All of these are speaking across traditional sets of values, traditional accepted norms of how you communicate. And I think in these sorts of, when you're crossing lines like that, I think it's really important to really focus on listening more than talking, and to listen in a way where you try to put yourself in the other person's head and try to think, what is this person telling me and what does it mean to them, and how can I understand it from their perspective, and then try to understand it from my own perspective.
Yeah, that's great, Terry. That really resonates with me, and it reminds me of something Sheila Watt-Cloutier really emphasized when she was giving me advice on something, and that is the idea of bridge building not being just between Western and Indigenous worldviews, but being between different disciplines in academia, different cultures within either the Indigenous world or the non-Indigenous world, different sectors, different generations. There's a lot of different dimensions in which understanding or misunderstanding can happen.
Yep.
And I think we're seeing that the rise of those misunderstandings all over the place right now.
Yeah, it's an abundant resource. So, one of the comments here, just another recommendation from an audience member on the overpopulation relative to overconsumption question, comes from Austin, who recommends a book called Less is More by Jason Hickel, highly relevant to the discussion of overconsumption in the global north and equity across the world in general. Probably worth a look. It gets a blurb from Kate Rayworth, who wrote Donut Economics, which is also widely recommended. So I'm looking at the clock, and I think it may be time to lob things back to you, Briony, to glide us toward a graceful and satisfying landing.
Well, I'd like to just pick up some of the beautiful tributaries of this stream, actually large river that we have been embarking on. To use a phrase by Elder Wached, Cecil Paul, I've been working with. We've been paddling in this, what his granny would call the magic canoe, in which people are invited into the canoe to navigate a pretty tumultuous journey for which everybody needs to get in and paddle. And provided that we're all paddling in the same direction, there's unlimited space in this canoe. So with that metaphor in hand, that's a Chanaksla metaphor, and indeed a practical consideration when you're in those incredible big rivers up north. I'm just wondering if you can finish, both of you, with, and you've touched on some of these, we've kind of roamed on some of these contentious, or not contentious, but really difficult issues. But I'm wondering if we can really look at hope, and how you maintain hope, and what is really giving you hope right now, given how immense these problems are. Maybe we'll start with Skye, or who wants to start on that one?
So I am maintaining hope. In this year in particular, I'm maintaining hope in part through kind of careful observation. I've been able to watch a particular rhubarb plant grow every day, and I have never had the opportunity to just like watch with so much attention. And that is really that kind of time and slowness is giving me some hope this year. But I think more broadly than that, I see so many people making incredibly courageous choices, leading incredibly courageous work. And I see people being willing to kind of take risks and invest in potential alternatives to try to find new ways of grappling with some of the big challenges that we're addressing. I see a lot of that happening in youth, and I think that I think that really gives me hope, because our young people are astute, they are paying attention, and they have so many ideas for how we can be living differently. So that's what's giving me hope these days. Thank you.
I totally agree with the importance of with the inspiration that comes from youth. They are doing amazing things, and that's really wonderful to see. Also, it strikes, I'm really impressed that many of the kinds of good things that are happening at scale around the world. So within a decade, there were, I can't remember the number, but maybe something on the order of 1,500 transition towns were developed that are focused entirely on renewable, recirculating economies. And there's a group of green sustainable cities that account for 25% of the world's urban population that have committed to green economies. There's transnational corporations that represent 10% of global GDP that are really focusing strongly on sustainable supply chains. So all of these things can happen in ways that can scale to have a global impact, but it all begins, as Skye was saying, on the things that happen locally. And I guess for me, just a pragmatic thing is, if I'm not hopeful, I'm not going to enjoy my life, so I might as well be hopeful. That's the part I can do something about.
Well, it's lovely that you mentioned transition towns, because Salt Spring Conservancy is part of the transition town on Salt Spring. And yesterday they had the most remarkable meeting I've ever been at, where 60 different organizations on Salt Spring alone all got together on a Zoom and agreed to work towards a climate action plan that was very specifically laid out, that included the stewardship of our forests, with some very innovative ideas about how we're going to do that, and how we're going to finance it, and how we're going to integrate everyone from the fire marshal's recommendations to the supermarket owner's recommendations. So I think that you're right. That's very inspiring. And I really want to, I think I'm brewing up. Are we got another time for another question, Dave, or?
Sure. Yeah, we can go right up till past.
Okay, well, I have a question which I want to throw back, which is, how are we going to support and hold up our youth? How are we, and I'm going to address this question to Terry, and then also to Skye, about how she and that generation would like to be held up and supported. How can we, as the boomers, support our youth in doing the great work they're doing right now?
I think part of it is just being role models for the kinds of values that we would appreciate seeing them carry on to their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren. So I think part of it is just investing in their success, in their development of their own values, which will probably be different than our values, and being supportive of that. And often that doesn't take a huge investment of money. It just takes investment of care, love, and empathy. And so it's not incompatible with reducing our own personal impacts on the planet.
So Skye, what can we do apart from opening up our homes and feeding you when there's not enough housing and not enough jobs and not enough support for that generation?
Ooh, okay. So I get to count as youth in this conversation.
On Salt Spring, you're a larva.
Okay, I think that be willing to be bold. That's my ask. I think that we need I think that we need, people who are more established in their careers to kind of embrace some of like the creativity and innovation that young people are bringing forward, and to courageously kind of walk alongside.
Fantastic.
Okay, so maybe we can put this out. We can put this out as a challenge on how, what that might look like. What's that might look like. I'm ever hopeful that the extraordinary energy that I get, for example, from the younger generations is enough to that make me want to meet that challenge, because it's such a great two-way system. I don't know what your thoughts are, Terry. Some of the courageous acts we can be doing right now.
Well, one of the things that's scary to me is reaching out and looking for conversations with people who have a very different political worldview than I do. And yet, I think that's one of the most important kinds of conversations to have, and it needs to be done gently and with respect. So boldly in terms of just having the guts to try to do it, but gently in terms of how that actually plays out. So this week I got invited by a foundation that of very conservative people. I think I don't know much about this foundation, but I think has a substantial religious dimension to it. And they wanted to have a conversation about climate change that enabled them to ask questions that enabled them to enter a conversation that questioned the conclusions of climate science. And I once got into a debate with some climate deniers that was one of the worst professional experiences of my life, because it got into a debate of whose facts were right, rather than what's the process of science, and how do you, if you have different conclusions, how do you sort out, begin to sort out the relative value of those different conclusions, or the relative validity of those. But I think that'll be a good learning experience for me, I think. But I think Skye's right. It's time to be bold. If I don't be bold soon, I'll never get around to it.
And what about the ability to take in some of the teachings of elders, where you really, when you go into those conversations, say as a scientist, you're also able to access your heart to such an extent that you are really fundamentally believing that we are all connected, that we are all our brothers and our sisters. Do you find that helps? Is that what's giving you the courage to make these bridges that you have between, communities or faith groups or cross-political
Those
divides?
conversations are the easiest and most fun conversations I've ever had. There's really no tension there at all. I just love talking to people who've got a different way of seeing nature and bring out things that I wouldn't have noticed, and have different ways of thinking about how they get their kids out in nature doing things, and don't spend as much time keeping track of them. One of the things that I feel somewhat sad about is that my son and most of his neighbors are very uncomfortable about letting their kids go out in the streets unless they've got a play date to go to a specific place. And I can't imagine having it. That just doesn't sound like a very nice way to interact with nature. It's too controlled.
So that's a topic for the next. Dave, I'm going to bat it back to you. That might be, that's a very extraordinarily large topic about how we integrate children back in the natural world, and it follows on, I think, a lot of these topics. I want to throw it also back to you, Skye. Maybe you're the closest to, if you got any final words on that, you know, that incredibly important time when, as a child, you're and as also as young mothers, like how to be courageous with your children and allow them to be in nature without some of the constraints that society has placed on them today.
Kids are born, I think all kids are born incredibly curious, as great observers. They love to spend time in the natural world. And so I think that we have an opportunity to kind of nurture that and continue to cultivate that and create opportunities for those things to continue. And we can do that even in places that are more restricted than they might have been in the past. But I also think that our kids are born hardwired with resilience and hardwired to struggle and to learn from that and to come out the other side. We learn the most when we are uncomfortable. And so, you know, can we allow our kids to go through tribulations and experiments and failures and trust them to come out the other side, hopefully carrying some of that curiosity and compassion along with them?
Yeah, well, I think it's part of our role is to create places for them and children to be. So that kind of takes us back to the Salt Spring Conservancy and other trusts that have been created. I think a million hectares of land has been protected for communities across British Columbia by land trusts. So a lot of that is for the next generation. So back to you, Dave. That was fun.
All right. Well, and that was a good metaphorical shift from kids mucking around in nature to adults mucking around in the world of ideas and actions to make nature still be there for the next generation of kids. So on behalf of the Conservancy, I just want to thank all of you for sticking it out till the end, and especially to sponsors and donors, but most especially to Skye and Terry and Briony for taking us on a rich and very smart journey today. I feel like every 6 or 7 words tonight could be blown out into another 2-hour conversation. So we have a lot of collective things to do in the future, and I hope you will all consider staying on that journey with us. So with that, thank you so very much, and have a good rest of your evening.
Yeah, hi, Chika.
Thank you. This was a fun conversation.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Yeah, and I guess the team can, if you want to hang out for another couple minutes, we can have a little debrief at the bar. I mean, it's so weird because normally after an event at Art Spring, you'd walk across the village over to the Salt Spring Inn and have a cup of tea and debrief. We can do that a little bit, but then we can, I guess a lot of people are going to listen in. But. So I thought that went really well. What did you guys think? It's kind of hard to read an audience through these devices, but how do you feel about it? You both came off as very warm and authentic and engaged even through the screen, I think.
I just really enjoyed my conversation with Skye. That was a real pleasure and a delight. A special opportunity for me. And it was great to learn about the Conservancy.
Oh yeah, I think yeah. I mean, it's weird. I think that the more I do these Zoom things, the more I realize how nice it is to have faces in front of you that you're talking, like humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Terry, like it's been such a privilege and an honor to get to hear some of the stories, and you just bring such a wealth of kind of different places and projects. I feel like I learned so much tonight, so thank you for that opportunity.
I felt exactly the same way, so thank you.
Well, it's getting a little old to talk about silver linings from the pandemic, but I suppose we've just discovered one here tonight.
Yep.
Yeah, very good. Well, thanks again so much. We'll do a follow-up thank you and, try to provide some edible gifts or something of the sort that we would normally provide in person after one of these things. We'll conjure what that is, but this has been just great. Thank you so, so much.
Well, I enjoyed it. It was great.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you all. Good night.
Okay.
Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right then. Night night.
Nighty night.